This is Digaris, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. This is flyer number 621, entitled, What is a Life Leecher? Description. The crash in the birth rate is one of the most alarming phenomena of our times that sooner or later has to be addressed. This flyer states that gender politics plays a major role in the cause of this birth rate crash. It also states that once the gender laws have largely been men-fared and women-fared, then governments and society can concentrate on pushing up the birth rate by applying a new term, life leechers, to adults who consciously choose not to reproduce themselves, thus contributing to the population crash, making them genociders and hence criminals. The term life leecher is deliberately coined to be a very negative label for such people who are not fulfilling their civic duty to reproduce themselves. The flyer itself. What is a life leecher? By Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. Email profhugodigaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodigaris.wordpress.com. I'm a great believer in the power of labels. Imagine someone calls you a racist. Probably you will feel you have been strongly insulted and you will react quite emotionally, implying that the label racist has real power over you. If someone called you a flenist, F-L-E-N-I-S-T, your reaction would very probably be indifferent, if not a bit puzzled, asking, what's a flenist? As a masculinist theorist, I use labels that I coin to attach to new ideas, new concepts that I feel are important, that need to be spread, so that large numbers of people can be aided in their thinking about these new ideas, these new concepts. This flyer introduces one such label that I believe will be useful in countering the crash in the birth rate that is solidly and relentlessly wiping out whole populations, a phenomenon that is one of the most alarming of our times that obviously needs to be addressed and halted, or Homo sapiens sapiens as a species will cease to exist. What has the birth rate, or the lack of it, to do with masculism and gender politics in general? Answer, a lot. Having children is increasingly unpopular these past few decades for a string of reasons, many of them intimately linked to gender politics. For example, the fluffy feminists have taken over the divorce courts and made divorce so toxic for men that now in many countries 2/3 and more of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity and spend their money on themselves. That is, they choose to live the lifestyle of a MGTOW, M-G-T-O-W, men going their own way, which, given their numbers in the millions now, is crashing the birth rate, which if one does the math is a trend that cannot continue, since if it does, we wipe ourselves out. So it then follows, sooner or later, politicians will have to become involved in measures to push up the birth rate. This flyer is a masculinist contribution to that effort by offering a new term, a new label that can be used, hopefully, to powerful effect in the fight to push the birth rate back to a replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. The worst birth rate in the world, as far as I know, is that of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, which stands at a pathetic 0.7 children per woman. That is a mere third of the replacement rate, which implies that if that rate continues for, say, 4 generations, then a century from now, Seoul will have wiped itself out. Since after 4 generations, with each generation reproducing only a third of its population, a third of a third of a third of a third is about 1%. So effectively Seoul will have wiped itself out. The MGTOWing of millions of men is not the only major cause of the crash in the birth rate. Another is the influence of feminists pushing female careerism, so that millions of women put off having kids, pursuing their careers well into their 30s, then run out of time to have even one child, let alone two, because they run into their biological clocks, which limit their fertility time windows to about 40 years of age, max. Most women experience a serious fertility drop by the age of about 35. So feminist careerism has also played an important role in the crash of the birth rate, but not as great as the MGTOW rejection of paternity, when 2/3 of young men in many countries now reject marriage and paternity due to the toxicity of divorce. Many governments are already well aware of the crash in their birth rates and are now actively thinking and working on solutions to this slow but relentless problem. For example, Hungary spends a whopping 5% of its GNP on birth stimulus measures, for example, paying out hefty premiums to mothers who have multiple children, by creating national creche systems, paying women a maternity wage to stay at home while the children are very small, pushing paternity leave so that fathers can play a role in caring for very small children, etc. These measures are fine in themselves, but they're not really biting the bullet, since from the point of view of masculists and other types of gender political actors, they do not go far enough. The masculists are saying that the main reason why young men reject marriage and paternity is due to the toxicity of the divorce courts. To remove this toxicity, fundamental changes will need to be made to society so that divorce is no longer toxic for men. And that will mean, say the masculists, the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society. And to achieve that, GECs, Gender Equality Committees, will need to be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes can be dealt with equally, which is definitely not the case today, in which most people are only monoconscious in their gender political knowledge. That is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised and know nothing about how women oppress men too. And in fact worse than vice versa, with women committing horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, such as women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc. Women's gender crimes against men will need to be stopped through structural changes in society, and especially with the men-fairing of the gender laws, for example, by fundamentally reforming the divorce courts so that divorce law is made fair to men, by, for example, throwing out alimony, giving custody of children jointly to both parents by default, so that fathers not have their kids ripped away from them with a 90% probability, as is in the case today in many countries, tossing out the sharing of wealth and stuff, etc. The divorce courts need to be based on the fundamental idea of financial independence of both divorcing parties, the mother and the father, so that men are not financially butchered in the divorce courts, the way they still are today, at a rate of about one father in 4. Damascus, this butchery of one father in 4 in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts is so hated that it is a war issue. So masculists punish fluffies severely by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, not even pumped and dumped, so that fluffies die a slow, miserable death, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at as hated, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin. So the masculists, particularly those politically minded masculists, see that to raise the birth rate, divorce has to be detoxified for men. That is, the monoconscious feminists who control the divorce courts have to be made biconscious, and that is the job of the masculists, to teach these women masculist ideas, so that these currently monoconscious feminists become bi-conscious and see that women oppress men too. Masculists target the boyfriends/partners/husbands of these monoconscious feminists, teaching these men masculist ideas so that they become bi-conscious, who then expect their feminist girlfriends/partners/wives to become bi-conscious. Or these feminists will risk being dumped by their bi-conscious boyfriends, who will not tolerate the monoconscious feminazi bigotry, MFB, of their girlfriends. Society needs to be men-feared by the fipping of women and the creation of a FIP society, which is one of the major jobs of the masculine half of the GECs, Gender Equality Committees. Women too need to be pressured to be mothers by the GECs and by politicians in general, since the wiping out of whole populations concerns everyone, so is a major and general issue that should concern all citizens and all politicians. To encourage women who love their careers, who also have babies, has motivated masculinist theorists to construct the MCT for women, that is, the mother career timeline for women, so that women can have the best of both worlds, that is, be mothers and have a real financially rewarding career, so that they are not manslaving, divorce-raping parasites of men's labour and money. For example, take the case of an upper middle class woman with the IQ necessary to get a master's degree in a career competent major, e.g. STEM or the professions. She gets her master's at 23 and works for 5 years in her well-paid career and marries during that time. She has her first kid at age 29 and her second at 31. Thus she and her husband have fulfilled their, in capital letters, civic duty to reproduce themselves. More on this later. At 35, her second kid is off to kindergarten and she goes back to her career so that she is not a fluffy parasite of her husband. During the 6 years that she is at home, looking after her small children, the government pays her a hefty maternity wage so that her husband is spared from being the sole breadwinner for the family, which is a very stressful situation. The above measures, that is the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society, the reform of the divorce courts, the men-fairing of the gender laws, etc., are probably not sufficient to restore the birth rate to replacement rate. So what else is necessary to motivate both sexes to have babies again? I believe that a powerful social pressure coming from both governments and society will need to be applied to both sexes to motivate them to have their 2 children per couple so that they reproduce themselves. I propose the use of the term life leecher, a very negative, pejorative term, to be applied to those adults who consciously choose not to reproduce themselves. As I said at the beginning of this flyer, I'm a strong believer in the power of labels. So I'm proposing this label that slips easily off the tongue with its 2 L's and its very negative connotations of being parasitic, that is benefiting from the sacrifices made by their parents in giving them birth and paying for their childhoods, but not doing the same for the next generation, and thus contributing to the crash of the birth rate, and thus contributing to the genocide of the population, making them criminals. So, imagine a decade from now, once governments have formed GECs, that nearly everyone has become bi-conscious, that gender politics is increasingly becoming irrelevant as society has become fair to both sexes, but the birth rate keeps crashing, so that governments and society become increasingly alarmed that measures have to be taken to push up the birth rate. Imagine then some life leecher being accused by his/her friends, parents, acquaintances of being just that, a life leecher. As the term becomes very familiar and it takes on a strong emotionally negative charge, then governments can use it as the basis for new legislation to punish life leechers by imposing very heavy taxes on them, denying them certain privileges regarding interest rates on house payments, etc. That is, punishing life leechers for contributing to the annihilation of the population by not doing their civic duty to their community, by leeching off the sacrifice of their parents and not paying back that sacrifice by doing the same for the next generation. To combat life leechers, gender politics will play a major role, as this flyer has explained. Once society and the gender laws have been men-faired and women-faired, then society can concentrate on pushing up the birth rate by penalising heavily the life leechers, making them feel excluded from society as generational parasites, as leeches off life, as undesirables. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 620 plus maskless flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.